Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Luke and chapter 9. The Gospel of Luke and chapter 9. With a general election having recently taken place in this country, and with another one about to take place in America, we are familiar, I'm sure, with the idea of an opinion poll. There is a concept that was invented in the 19th century by a man called Mr. Gallup. You may recognise that name because there still is the Gallup opinion poll, and it has been used enormously by political parties and by political pundits ever since. And although the opinion polls are not a guaranteed prediction of what is going to happen, it's not a guaranteed prediction. There is, however, someone who uses them to make a very reliable prediction. And that is a man called Professor John Curtis. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that name. You will have seen him in the run-up to the general election. He's from that highly respected academic institution called Strathclyde University. Anybody here study at Strathclyde? Yes, that makes two of us then. Well done. Time and time again, you may have noticed, every time the general election comes round, time and time again, his exit poll on election night has proved to be extremely accurate. No longer is it worth sitting up to 4 a.m. to see who's going to win, because Mr. Curtis tells you at 10 who is going to win. If ever anyone has mastered the art of telling us how the nation is going to vote or has voted, then that is Mr. Curtis. The big question, however, is, do we know how Mr. Curtis has voted? And the answer is no, we don't. And so although he's very good at telling us what conclusions everyone else has come to concerning our politicians and our political parties, he never reveals what conclusions he has come to himself. And as we come to this passage in Luke chapter 9, we find some men doing a similar thing, which leads me to my first point this morning, and that is in verses 18 to 20. And there we are told about the correct conclusion concerning Jesus. The correct conclusion concerning Jesus. Now, having miraculously catered for thousands of people on a previous occasion, Jesus and his disciples are now spending some time together in private. And during that time, Jesus asked his disciples a rather unusual question, recorded for us in verse 18. Who do the crowds say that I am? Who do the crowds say that I am? In other words, says Jesus to his disciples, what does the general public think of me? What is their opinion of me? What conclusions have they come to with respect to my true personal identity? Who do the people think I am? And these men don't need to employ a Mr. Curtis or a Mr. Gallup to answer that question, because although they haven't been carrying out opinion polls as such, they had a very good idea as to what the people thought about Jesus. If ever there was a reliable polling company on the subject of Jesus, it was these men. Because as they've travelled from place to place with Jesus, they had picked up plenty of feedback, and so they were able to answer Jesus' questions there and then. They didn't have to go and switch on the computer and do some research. No, they had the answer at their fingertips. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life. Now, the names they mention are all names of people who would have been very familiar names to people within the land of Israel. They were all names of people who had played a prominent role in Israel's history. They are the names of the prophets from the past, but who are now dead, although in the case of John the Baptist, his death was quite recent. And the conclusion which many had come to about Jesus is that one of those past prophets has come back to life to continue their prophetic ministry. As a result of his miracles and teaching, Jesus has obviously made quite an impression upon the people within the nation of Israel. That's why they have come to some remarkable conclusions about him. They have come to the conclusion that he is someone special. They have come to the conclusion that he is a man of religious significance, so much so that they rank him amongst some of their religious heroes from the past. That is the conclusion that many back then came to about Jesus. And if we were to carry out an opinion poll today on the beach at Bentlick or on the high street, asking people what they thought of Jesus, what sort of answers would we get? We would probably get quite a variety of opinions on who Jesus was and is. And some people would tell us that although he did exist in the history of our world, he's now no longer relevant. While others would be of a similar opinion to the people back in his day. Some people would still want to classify him as someone special. They would acknowledge that he has played a prominent role in the history of our world, and so he would be put in a special category, along with other men of religious and philosophical significance from the past, men such as Muhammad and Confucius, the Dalai Lama, and so on. He would be ranked amongst them. That is what some people today think about Jesus. But then it's one thing to be asked what other people think about someone. It's another thing altogether to be asked what you think of that person. And that's exactly what happened to these disciples on this occasion. Having been asked by Jesus what the crowds thought of him, in one sense that was the easy question to answer. But having been asked that question, they're now asked this question, verse 20. But what about you? Who do you say I am? The spotlight was now in them. And it was impossible for them to duck the issue. What about you? Jesus said to them. What is your opinion of me? What is your estimation of me? What conclusions have you come to concerning my true identity? Who do you say I am? If you had been one of those men standing there, what answer, I wonder, would you have given to Jesus' question? If you were stopped on the street today, or if you were asked on your way out of this service, and don't panic, I won't be asking you, but if you were stopped and asked what your opinion of Jesus is, what would you say? What would you say? What conclusions have you come to concerning his identity? How would you answer his question, who do you say I am? Would you do what some within our society do and consider him an absolute irrelevance from the past? Or would you do what others do? Would you shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's quite a few years since he was around, and so we don't really know much about him. We don't really know who he was or what to make of him. Or would you do what many back in Jesus' day did, and that is, would you rank him amongst the great men and women of history? If your answer would be any of those, then I would ask you to seriously think again. Even if you're prepared to rank him alongside the greatest men and women of history, I say that because that is precisely the mistake which the majority of people back then made. They thought that Jesus was someone to be ranked alongside other men. Well, as far as their selection of men from history was concerned, they couldn't have chosen better. Elijah and John the Baptist were undoubtedly great men, but their mistake back then was that they thought Jesus was comparable with those men, and they thought those men were comparable with Jesus. Their mistake was that they failed to appreciate the uniqueness of Jesus. And if you would merely rank Jesus amongst the great men and women of history, then that is also the mistake that you're making this morning, because you too are failing to appreciate his uniqueness. Oh, thankfully, there were some people back then who did appreciate who he really was. For example, when those disciples were asked to give their own opinion of Jesus, their personal opinion, a man called Peter, he acted, as he quite often did, as a spokesman on behalf of the rest of the group, and he spoke up and said this in reply. He said, "You are the Christ of God. You are the Christ of God." Now, the word Christ was not Jesus' surname. Because we are so familiar with the name Jesus Christ, we sometimes think that Jesus was his forename and Christ was his surname. Instead, it was a title. It was a title which revealed the true identity of Jesus. It is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. And so what Peter was saying in response to Jesus' question was, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah who has come from God. Having witnessed his miracles, having heard his teaching, and having heard the extraordinary claims which Jesus made concerning himself, Peter and his fellow disciples have come to the conclusion that he is much more than a prophet. They have come to appreciate his uniqueness. They have come to see that he is the Christ, the long-awaited Messianic King promised throughout the Old Testament scriptures, the divine deliverer whom God had promised to send in order to rescue his people. And can I say this morning that until you come to see that that is who Jesus is, then you haven't appreciated the true identity of this man. And if you haven't, then can I encourage you to read through the previous 8 chapters of Luke's Gospel. And I say that because this question that Jesus presents his disciples and us with in verse 20, this question doesn't just appear out of nowhere. No. It's a question that comes after several chapters that have recorded some of the extraordinary things that Jesus did and said during his time on this earth. For example, in chapter 4, there is the record of him healing people. In chapter 5, there is a record of him claiming to have the right to forgive sin, a right that belongs to God alone. In chapter 7, there is a record of him bringing a dead girl back to life. In chapter 8, there is a record of him calming a storm, something which only the creator of this world could possibly do. These disciples have witnessed those events. And it is on the basis of what they have heard Jesus say and on the basis of what they have seen Jesus do that they have come to the conclusion that he is someone who stands unique in the history of our world, the Messiah, the Christ of God. And if you read those historical records yourself, and as you do so, ask the question, what sort of person could possibly do this sort of thing? Someone who raises the dead. Someone who calms a ferocious storm just like that. someone who claims to forgive sin. What sort of person could possibly do those sort of things? Ask yourself that question, and I'm sure you too will be challenged to consider afresh your conclusions concerning this Jesus. His actions and his words throughout the previous chapters have demonstrated that this is a man who possessed a power and an authority that belongs to God and to God alone. And if you've never come to that conclusion concerning Jesus, the conclusion that he is the Christ come to us from God, God himself who has come to this earth as a man, if you've never come to that conclusion, then can I encourage you to consider afresh, perhaps for the first time or perhaps for another time, consider afresh the historical evidence as to who Jesus really is. Consider it again, for the simple reason that it's vitally important that you come to the correct conclusion about Jesus. Secondly, verses 21 and 22, and there we see the serious implications for Jesus being the Christ. The serious implications for Jesus being the Christ. Now, following Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah sent from God, Jesus, we are told in verse 21, warned his disciples not to tell anyone. And that may surprise you, but the reason was that many within Israel had wrong expectations concerning the Messiah. They were expecting a Messiah who would accomplish political, military, and economic deliverance for Israel. And so if word got around that Jesus was the Messiah, many would have assumed that he was going to lead a political or a military uprising against their foreign Roman oppressors, and that's why Jesus tells them to refrain from broadcasting their discovery for the time being. But as you work your way through the Gospels, you discover that it wasn't only the general public who had wrong ideas about Messiahship. The disciples, they also took some time to understand what it was the Messiah had come to accomplish. And that is why, following their confession that he is the Christ, that is why Jesus has to start to explain to his disciples the implications of his Messiahship. Speaking about himself, Jesus says this in verse 22, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life." You see, says Jesus, being the Messiah does not mean that I experience a life of popularity or prestige. In fact, says Jesus, being the Messiah means the exact opposite. As the Messiah, I am going to be rejected. I am going to suffer. I am going to be put to death. But listen, says Jesus, being the Messiah, I am also going to be raised to life again. Those, says Jesus, are the implications of my Messiahship. Now, for these disciples, those words of Jesus would have come as a real shock. In fact, in another of the Gospels, we are told that on hearing Jesus say those words, Peter took Jesus aside and rebuked him, convinced that Jesus must have got it all wrong. What Jesus has described on this occasion has shattered all that they had previously believed and all that they had previously expected concerning the character and the role of the Messiah. Up until this point, the idea of a suffering Messiah, the idea of a rejected Messiah, the idea of a crucified Messiah would have been a complete contradiction in terms as far as these men were concerned. But what they will come to appreciate over the following weeks and months is that the purpose of the Messiah's coming was to deliver men and women not from political oppression, but from spiritual oppression. They will come to realize that the Messiah's mission is to liberate men and women not from the tyranny of the Roman Empire, but from the tyranny of sin and of Satan. That was his mission. Because that's the greatest need of men and women back then, and that is the greatest need of men and women today. Our greatest need, contrary to what we often think and contrary to what we are often told, our greatest need today is not our political or our physical or our economic or even our emotional struggles, however great some of them may be. Our greatest need is deliverance from the power of sin within our lives and to be rescued from the eternal punishment which that sin deserves. In spite of what the majority of people back then thought, that was their greatest need. And that is still our greatest need. And that is the need which Jesus has come to meet. And in order to do so, he had to suffer. And he had to die. He had to suffer not only at the hands of cruel men and Roman soldiers, but he also had to suffer at the hands of an angry God. Being a righteous God, I don't know what your understanding of God is. When someone mentions the word God, I don't know what sort of thoughts come into your mind. But have you ever considered that being a righteous and a holy God, God is angry with sinners like you and me? The Bible makes it clear that God's anger, God's wrath towards sinners is a present reality which will be fully expressed on a future day of judgment. And it was for the very purpose of rescuing sinful men and women like us from the present wrath and future judgment of God that Jesus came into this world as the divinely promised, long-awaited messianic deliverer. That was Jesus' messianic mission. But in order to accomplish that mission, he had to die in the sinner's place. He had to take the sinner's punishment. That is what it meant to be the Messiah. And that is what the Old Testament had said all along concerning the Messiah. For example, Psalm 22 records the anointed messianic king, describing both his rejection by men and his abandonment by God. Isaiah 53, which we read earlier in the service, it tells us that the righteous servant of the Lord, i.e. the Messiah, he would be pierced and wounded and put to death on account of his people's sin. Contrary to what many within Israel thought, that was how the Old Testament scriptures had portrayed the Messiah's work, and contrary even to his disciples' expectations. Those were the implications, the serious implications of Jesus being the Christ, the Messiah sent from God. Thirdly and finally, verses 23 to 26, and there we see the enormous implications of following this Jesus. The enormous implications of following this Jesus. Now, as you read through Luke's account, you discover that the disciples not only had some wrong ideas to begin with concerning the work of the Messiah, they also had some wrong ideas to begin with as to what was involved in following the Messiah. Having assumed the Messiah was going to be a popular, a powerful, prestigious political figure, they also assumed that power and prestige and popularity would be the lot of those who followed him. And so, having told them about what was involved in being the Christ, the Messiah, Jesus now tells these men what is involved in following this Christ. If anyone would come after me, says Jesus, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Having lived in Israelite towns, these disciples would probably have known men who had been sentenced to death by the Romans, and that would have been death by crucifixion. And on the day of someone's execution, a small contingent of Roman soldiers would arrive in the village of the person about to be executed. They would bring with them a cross, or at least the top cross-section of a cross. And on their arrival at the home of the condemned man, knock on the door. And he would then take up that cross, and he would carry it to the place of his execution. To take up one's cross meant literally the end of one's life. And in a figurative sense, taking up one's cross means the end of one's selfish and self-centered life. It means the utmost in self-denial. And says Jesus in verse 23, that is precisely what is required of those who want to follow me. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and on a daily basis take up his cross and follow me, so that rather than living for self, they will now live for Jesus. Rather than striving to satisfy their own selfish interests and their sinful desires, they will now live for his interests and the fulfillment of his great agenda. Rather than living for their own sinful, selfish self-promotion, they will now live for his glory. That is the self-denial that is required of Jesus' followers on a daily basis, because following Jesus means following in his footsteps. And just as the pathway of the Messiah was one of suffering and sacrifice, so Jesus makes it clear that the pathway of those who would follow him will be one of suffering and self-sacrifice. Just as Messiahship had serious and challenging implications for Jesus, so his Messiahship has serious and challenging implications for those who want to follow this Jesus. And so that being the case, let me ask you, are you prepared this morning to follow this man? To follow this Jesus, this Christ, this Messiah who has come from God? Will you follow him? And if you're thinking to yourself, no way, on the basis of what you've just said about self-sacrifice and self-denial and all the rest of it, that is going to cost far too much. And so if you don't mind, I'll give that a miss, preacher. Well, before you come to that conclusion, can I draw your attention to the words of Jesus in verses 24 to 26? In verse 24, Jesus says that if anyone wants to save his life, in other words, if anyone dismisses the idea of following Jesus because they're determined to cling on to their own little sinful, selfish, self-centered life at all cost, then such a person, says Jesus, will ultimately lose their life. They will lose it. But on the other hand, says Jesus, those who are prepared to lose their life, those who are prepared to deny themselves and hand over control of their lives to Jesus, those are the people who actually end up with true life and with lasting life. It is those people who actually live life as life was meant to be lived, And there is those people who will enjoy life throughout a coming eternity. You see, in deciding whether we are prepared to follow this Jesus or not, it is important that we take the long view. And I say that because this life is not all that there is. Our little 60, 70, 80 years on this earth is not all that there is. There is an eternity, and that is the point that Jesus goes on to make in verse 25 when he says, "What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit his very self or his very soul?" I want you to try and imagine for a minute someone who gains the whole world. Can you picture that? I'm not talking about someone merely winning the jackpot on the national lottery. I'm talking about someone who possesses far more than that. All the money in the world, all the property in the world, all the possessions and far more, all that this world has to offer. Can you imagine someone doing that? But in doing so loses or forfeits his very self, his life, his enjoyment of life in this world, and worse still, his possession of life in eternity. What good, says Jesus? What good has all the wealth and the possessions done for him? No good whatsoever. And so that being the case, we should think twice about being determined to cling on to all that we have in this life, rather than following Jesus. We should think twice about it because there are two serious consequences of pursuing that course of action. The first is the forfeiting of life in the present, the loss of life as life was meant to be lived. And the second is the forfeiting of life in the future. And that eternity for such people will be an eternity of death rather than life. That is the frightening eternal prospect that Jesus is describing in verse 26 when he says, "If anyone is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels." What a frightening prospect. What a frightening prospect. And so rather than find yourself in that situation in the future, at the return of Jesus Christ, rather than find yourself in that situation, it's much better and it's much wiser to identify with Jesus in the present. To give your allegiance to this Jesus now. This Jesus who gave up his life for people like you and me. This Jesus who in his death was suffering the eternal punishment that sinful people like you and I deserved. This Jesus who made that selfless sacrifice so that people like us might have life. Life that is true. Life that is lasting. Life that is eternal. Rather than clinging on at all cost to what you currently possess, and rather than being determined at all cost to remain king of your own little life, come what may, rather than do that, put your trust in this Jesus and give your allegiance to him. Submit to his authority in your life, rather than being ruler and king of your own life. Submit to his authority in your life, and in doing so you will know the true life and the lasting life and the eternal life, which is only to be known by following him. Those are the implications, the enormous implications of following or not following this Jesus who is the Christ. You remember what we saw in the video? Yes, we're all running a race. We're all living a life. But what are we aiming for at the end? What is our ultimate goal? What is the ultimate prize that we're striving for? That is the question that Jesus put to his disciples. And that is the question we need to consider this morning. 3 things we've heard Jesus described as he talked to his disciples on this occasion. Firstly, the correct conclusion concerning Jesus. Secondly, the serious implications of Jesus being the Christ. And thirdly, the enormous implications of following him.